So welcome everybody for our final session today. Well done for keeping your presence and your concentration up for what has been a long but I hope fruitful series of talks so far. We're delighted to have Dr. Tim Hutchings with us for this last session of Tuesday. He's a sociologist of religion, and I hope he might in his introduction tell us a little bit more about that in and of itself. He's also the, in addition to that, the assistant professor of religious ethics at the University of Nottingham. His interests include how ritual, community, and authority are finding new forms in digital culture, and we'll, I'm sure, hear a lot more about what that means, that area of digital culture. He researches things like studies of online churches, digital Bibles, and death online. So I know at least one student is going to be really interested in that. He's the author of Creating Church Online, and he edits the Journal of Religion, Media, and Digital Culture. So thank you, Tim, so much for being with us today, and I will just hand over to you.
Thank you. So a sociologist of religion is kind of the closest thing I've got to a job title at the moment. And I don't know, that you may find that a lot of your Sarum lectures say similar things. My research has kind of wandered across several different disciplines as time goes on. And I was pretty sure when I started out that I was going to be a theologian, and quite quickly discovered that I was actually much more interested in people and why people think what they think, and why people do what they do. And I was actually much less interested in whether they were right or wrong about it, which is my very pejorative view of what theologians get up to as a sociologist. And I can dimly hear all of the kind of practical theology people who work at Sarum going hiss in the background. But so I got really interested in what we can sometimes call the sociological imagination, which is trying to work out how society ticks, basically, and what's the role of religion in how society ticks. And my research has often started off by surprise or amusement, maybe I used to say I'd often start off a research project by laughing at something and thinking, wait, why is that? There's something that people are doing that I hadn't expected, and it's made me laugh. Well, why has that made me laugh? And what does that reveal about my expectations and my assumptions about society? And then I'm off for many years trying to kind of figure out what's going on. So I got interested in studying digital religion originally as a master's student. I had a life-changing conversation with a member of my department who I'm quite sure has forgotten the whole thing, as is often the case with life-changing conversations, because I had a very ambitious theological plan to kind of finally discover how God communicates with humanity or something like this in a master's thesis. And the person who was in charge of research at my university at that time said, well, that seems a bit ambitious. You've only got 10,000 words, and I think you'll find a lot of people have written about that already. Is there anything you can think of that's really new that maybe you could have your own original thought about that no one else has studied? And this was just about a year or so after the Church of England launched its first ever internet church. And there was huge amounts of media coverage of this. All of the Radio 4 comedy shows did a skit about it, which as a person who listened to Radio 4 coming home from school every day was kind of very significant for me, that the news quiz thought that this was an important thing. So I started looking into this and discovered that actually there was quite a lot to say about it, I think, which then eventually ended up becoming a book and a whole career studying different ways in which religion, particularly Christianity, and digital media come together. So in some ways, I'm a bit of an imposter for this session, and I'm really looking forward to finding out what you all have to contribute to this discussion, because you're interested in mission, and mission is not a sociological category, which is what sociologists normally say when really they mean this is nonsense. You can't measure it, you can't sort of put it under a microscope, you can't interview it. So I'm exploring this concept that's not really mine. I think it'll be much more comfortable for you than it is for me. Thinking about what mission might be in a kind of digital context. So I'm looking forward to some of you wanting to jump in, interrupt, ask questions, disagree with me as we go along. So let's share some slides with you. I am screen sharing, I'm told. Here we go. So, digital evangelism and digital mission. The two images that you can see on the screen there are from a virtual church. It's actually a bit different from the kind of thing I studied for my PhD and my MA years ago. This is a relatively cutting edge, new kind of virtual church that you access through a virtual reality headset. What really fascinates me about this, or one of the things that fascinates me about this, going back to that odd comment I made earlier about humor, is that about a year before this was launched, a Christian group did a comedy sketch on YouTube, imagining the most ridiculous thing they possibly could, and it was someone going to church with a headset on. And then, lo and behold, it came true. So this is a group that has been quite successful, as far as we can tell. It's based in the United States, run by a guy who's been interviewed all around the world by Wired magazine and the BBC and all sorts of other places. And one of his claims is that through this virtual church, he is starting to baptize people. So I actually gave a talk for Sarah quite recently in your Christian initiation, module, about digital baptism. And this was one of the case studies we looked at, because you can watch videos on YouTube of this virtual environment baptizing people with virtual water, using their online names, which is one interesting part of this. So like Squirrel Girl 53 or whatever it is getting baptized in the pool here and talking about her journey of faith. So when we're faced with things like this, we could ask, does the Christian church need a digital theology? And for a lot of the history of Christianity and media, as we'll see as we go along, the church has mostly said no, I think, to that, which is quite an interesting point. It seemed like we had the coming of a wave of digital theology in the 1990s, the early 2000s, and it kind of went away. And we'll look at that in a little later on. As digital media became more and more part of everyday life, it seemed that Christians felt more and more that it didn't really need its own theology. We'll just do normal theology and we'll do it with our Zoom cameras on. I imagine Sarah, for example, has not yet started a module on Zoom theology, as though you need a special theology for using Zoom. It's just, it's just theology. So the counter argument, of course, would be from somewhere like the church, that virtual church we were just looking at, that says, well, no, there's a reason why we're doing baptism in this environment, and you have to understand the environment in order to work out if baptism here is appropriate or not. So if the church may or may not have a digital theology, does it have a digital mission? Here is a digital cat. Does the church have a digital mission? And I don't have an answer to this necessarily. I'm going to propose a few answers later on. But I would be very interested to know what you think in your response to this. Does the church have a mission, which is the same everywhere? And we just have to, or you just have to kind of implement that in a digital context? Or is there actually something distinctive about the church's response to digital environments? So, to start off, I'm going to think a little about the theology of technology. And then I'm going to show you 4 visions of a digital mission. And this is where we get into digital evangelism as most my kind of task for the session. And what I want to show you is that the way Christians do evangelism online, the way they do mission online, is very closely connected to the way they think about what kind of a thing digital media is. So the way Christians do theology, the way they do evangelism, the way they do mission is quite closely connected to their understanding of the world around them. That might be another way of thinking about this. And I'll show you 4 different, what we might call 4 different metaphors for digital media. and the way that each of them creates a distinctive sort of evangelism. But to start with, what is a theology of technology? This is an early version of the theology of technology. And as I've mentioned, one of the really interesting things about this is that theology kind of bubbles up in a very creative way right at the start of the digital age, or at least right at the start of the kind of mass internet age. And then it dies down again. And then I think this last year, we've seen it explode back into life. This is a screenshot of Time magazine's cover story on religion and the internet from way back in the mid 1990s. And this is a frustratingly good article. It's actually quite hard to track down now. But if you go and you find this article and you read it, the things they discuss are pretty much all of the topics that we've talked about in the study of internet and religion for the following 30 years. They talk about how the internet is going to affect authority and community. They're fascinating interviews with people who were doing really innovative things at that early time. But one of their arguments is that the internet is going to change the way Christians think about God. You can see in this quote, "We stand at the start of a new movement in the delicate dance of technology and faith, the marriage of God and the global computer networks. Is it possible that God in a networked age will look somehow different?" And there's quite a lot of this sort of thinking going around in the 1990s. Inspired, among others, by Teilhard de Chardin, who's decades earlier is writing books about evolution and science and faith, and has this vision that one day human consciousness will be connected into a newer sphere, a mind sphere encircling the world. And as soon as the internet came along, people were absolutely delighted to say, that's it, that's the newer sphere. It was in Christian theology all along. So just as I am not looking at the chat while I'm talking. So if anyone wants to ask a question, you're going to have to say it out loud or I won't see it. So the argument here is that as people become connected in a different sort of way, they will want to turn to different metaphors for thinking about God. As people stop being individuals or local communities, the idea of God as a Lord or a master will lose all meaning, and instead we'll think about God as the network. And so there's some quite creative theology done in the 90s and the early 2000s, thinking about particularly the Trinity. The Trinity as a dance, and the dance of the Trinity as the way of thinking about networked society in an internet age when everybody is kind of talking to everybody and moving in and out of community and relationships. But one of the things that's very interesting about this is it goes away. There's an early creativity, but let's kind of move this on a little. Where is the theology of the motor car? Where is the theology of the light bulb? How many people have you invited to Sarum College to give guest lectures on the theology of the radiator or the bus? This is one of the curious things about technology. A new technology transforms our society. It transforms the way we relate to each other, the way we think about ourselves, and then we stop seeing it. It becomes a part of everyday life. It becomes almost unthinkable to imagine life without that thing. And it becomes invisible to us. It tends to become invisible until it breaks down. So if you think, if you've got smartphones, the way you're thinking about communication or about access to data changed the first time you got a smartphone that allowed you to walk around outside the house, talking to people anytime you wanted to. It seemed really strange for a little bit that you could, if you had a question, you could just look it up on Google absolutely anywhere you were. And then it becomes incredibly normal. And then it becomes very frustrating if you can't get a good internet connection on your phone. And we have the same sort of thing with digital theology. The internet seems very new. It's going to radically change everything. And then it becomes so important to our everyday lives that people just stop noticing it. And this sort of theological argument the idea that God, our vision of God would change, was replaced quite quickly by much more kind of technical, practical arguments about how do we get more people to follow the Church of England on Twitter, that kind of thing. One thing that I noticed is that the people doing the digital work changed. So in the 90s and the early 2000s, there's a category of kind of amateur theologian programmers, people who are they're vicars or priests or theologians, and they really love computers, and they're trying to think about how to put these together. And by about 10 years ago, those people get replaced by professional digital experts who have no training in theology. And it becomes very standard that if you go to a kind of internet theology conference now, somebody will stand up and say, well, I do all of this for the Church of England or the Catholic Church or whatever. I'm not a theologian. Don't ask me about that. I actually worked for Sainsbury's last year. I've just been brought in. Let me tell you how we got 10,000 views on our Instagram feed or whatever it might be. 10 million likes on Twitter or something. So what is the theology of technology? The theology of technology tries to think on a broader scale than this. It recognizes that technology changes the world and becomes very hard for us to see. And so actually over particularly the 20th century, from kind of the mid 20th century on, there are philosophers and theologians thinking really profound thoughts about the ways in which a society governed by technology and governed by media might feel differently about God, about religion, and about itself. And from that record of the philosophy of technology and the theology of technology, here's 3 points that I'd like to hammer on the wall or whatever. The first is that technology is never neutral. Technologies affect what we do, how we think, and how we relate to others, even though we might not realize that. It's interesting to think back to someone like Rudolf Bultmann, who was a kind of classic of my theological education many years ago, talking about the idea that there can be no miracles in an age of light bulbs. It's a very famous quote. And to people thinking nowadays, that seems ridiculous. Who cares about light bulbs? No, light bulbs don't matter at all. But of course they do. Light bulbs transform society. They allow you to do things after dark without lighting a fire. That's hugely important. But it's just become a kind of natural part of what we expect about the universe. So technology is never neutral, even though we often think it is. Technology is invisible. It's incredibly hard to see exactly how any technology is affecting us. But, and this is the more controversial third point, we're not helpless. And different philosophers and theologians have disagreed about this issue. But I'd like to say we're not helpless in the face of technology and media. We've still got an opportunity to reflect on the technologies that we use, to decide what to do with them, and to shape how we think about them. Even though we don't really have the choice to live in a world without electricity. It's just there. We can still reflect on how electricity is shaping who we are. We can still reflect on what the internet is doing to us, and we can shape how we use technologies, how we think about them, particularly going forwards. We can try and have some sort of input into how technology is shaped for us. And so you see Christian groups occasionally trying to speak up to people like Facebook or Twitter or the new developers of artificial intelligence to say, actually, we've got some ideas about what's wrong with these technologies and how we'd like them to be changed. This is one place I'm getting that third point, we're not helpless, where I'm getting it from. This is Heidi Campbell, who is one of the leading scholars of digital religion. Heidi is best known for a theory called the religious social shaping of technology, which is fairly straightforward in some ways. It's just the idea that basically technologies are made by people, which you might think is very obvious, but it's easy to forget sometimes that actually there's groups of people making everything that we use, and they've got ideas about what they want. And religious groups can join in with that making process by, in Heidi's vision, reflecting on their core beliefs, their histories, their traditions, their central values, and how they talk and think about the technologies around them. This is another way of approaching the same kind of question, I think, from Quentin Schultz. And I think this is a useful quote, so I've put it in, from a discussion about worship and technology that Schultz had in 2012. To do technology and worship well, goes the quote, you have to fit technology to the worship rather than the worship to the technology. Otherwise, the worship can become distorted. This kind of fits in with what Campbell is arguing, I think. The first thing that Christians need to do when they're embracing a new technology is to start reflecting on their own core beliefs and values and practices and what is essential about worship or about mission. And then figure out how to use technology to get across those central and essential things. Now, you could say, based on what we've just been discussing, that maybe Schultz is a bit optimistic in this little quote. The worship is always going to be changed by the technology, but you can at least try to make sure that the worship comes first, or the mission. So that's my kind of starting point of key principles for a theology of technology that's worth us bearing in mind. It's never neutral, its effects are often invisible, but you're not helpless in the face of technology. And now I'd like to think about 4 different visions of mission. Does anyone have a comment or a question on this bit of the lecture before we go on?
We did have a question come through in the chat asking what was the name of the virtual church that you mentioned right at the beginning?
Well, I think it's V-Church.
V-Church.
The one right at the beginning was iChurch. That's the Church of England's first church is called iChurch, and it still exists. You can still join it. It's i-church.org. The virtual reality church is V-Church, which launched just a couple of years ago. Yes, but anyway, so I'll come on to tell you a bit more about online churches later on, because I tend to end up talking about them in whatever subject it is I'm supposed to be lecturing out. It ends up being about online churches. So 4 visions of digital mission. And the first one is the idea that digital media is just a tool. So going back to those 3 principles of technology, the first one is technology is never neutral. That is really difficult for a lot of Christians to get their head around. You may have heard the famous, particularly evangelical catchphrase, which goes something like, the methods change, but the message never does, something like this, the message never changes. Nonsense. As soon as you've changed the media that you're using and the methods you're using, your message kind of changes as well, because technology is never neutral. But the first vision of digital mission tries to ignore that possibility and just uses digital media as a tool to try and communicate the same sort of gospel message that has always been preached. So, for example, here is an evangelistic website. It's called peacewithgod.net. There are quite a few different examples like this out there, run by all the big evangelical evangelistic groups, Campus Crusade for Christ and Billy Graham and so on and so forth. Peacewithgod.net is one of these, and it's a website that walks you through a conversion into Christianity. And really, it's a pretty expensive, elaborate website. It's got these little nicely produced videos, but what it's doing is updating the most classic of gospel tracts, which I, as a teenager, was given in huge quantities. This is a paper booklet that walks you through kind of four steps on your journey to Christ, turned into a website. And you're supposed to go through, boop, 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 watch the videos, convert, and then at the end there's a prayer. Pray now, so you pray this, and then at the bottom, did you pray this prayer, yes or no? You click yes, or you click no, but I have a question, and then it will try and put you in touch with somebody to talk to. So it's a simple and traditional way of thinking about evangelism, updated for a digital audience. This is a very old screenshot, but it comes from another example of what I'm thinking of here as digital mission as a tool. This is Life.Church, which is one of the biggest churches in the United States, although it's not, I think, hugely famous. I'm told by design. At least when I was studying this group about 10 years ago, they consciously stayed under the radar and didn't get involved too much in politics and other issues. But for example, when Willow Creek collapsed in its big scandal recently, it was Craig Groeschel of Life Church who stepped in to try and assist. So that this is a multi-sited megachurch, which is one reason it doesn't get too much attention, I think. It has an enormous congregation, but spread over 20 or 30 different locations around particularly Oklahoma and the southern United States. Each of those runs a little bit like a giant cinema auditorium. You've got a huge screen, you've got hundreds of seats. People come in, and then on the big screen on a Sunday, they watch the sermon preached by Craig Groeschel from Oklahoma City. And there'll be a live band performing in the auditorium, but what you're really going there for is to watch the broadcast, or at least the recording of the sermon that is preached from the central location. And they have put all of this online. And so online they have an audience of hundreds of thousands, or so they say. Because the sermon is recorded, they play the sermon many times every day, all the way through the week. There's a team of hosts who man the chat room every time the thing runs. And if you feel moved by the end, you can click on a button that says, "I surrender my life to Jesus," hand goes up. And there's a little count that says the number of hands have been raised. And part of what makes this work, I think, is that they have changed almost nothing from the multi-sited local event to the online setting. It's almost identical to the experience you would get if you actually went along and sat in one of the auditoriums. But they are counting how many times that button gets clicked. There's a bit of follow-up if the button gets clicked. They know, I'm quite sure, that the number of people clicking that button does not actually relate to people transforming their lives, because it's only a button click. There is a bit of follow-up that you can get. You can ask them to post you a Bible for free if you've clicked that button. But they are advertising that number of clicks. This is a current screenshot: 100,004 salvations at church online and counting. And as you watch this, it slowly ticks upwards, of course. Here's taking this maybe to an even more extreme version. Using the digital world to convert people really without any, as I see it, any theological engagement with what digital media might mean. If you can convert somebody by handing them a pamphlet, or by showing them a recording of your sermon with a button to press at the end, can you convert somebody using AI? Do there have to be people involved in this at all? Isn't that just a bit inefficient? What if you could get a chatbot, the kind of chatbot that helps you out on your bank's website or a clothing website or whatever? What if you programmed a chatbot with a few kind of missionary answers to questions about Jesus, and then you set it loose on the internet? And here is that chatbot. It's called Who is Jesus Bot? An automated bot that will take you on your own journey of self-discovery to learn more about Jesus. And if you want to, you can talk to a human, but that's entirely unnecessary for the conversion process. The makers of the Who is Jesus bot claim that it is highly successful. And it's maybe worth us thinking. We'll come back to this a bit later because it's kind of an interesting point. Do you actually need people in your conversion process, or do they just get in the way? So that's the first one, the tool to use. The second approach, which is very different, thinks about digital media as a world. This is kind of going back to the 90s language of cyberspace, the digital world. And it's a world that you enter. And here we're on terrain that Christian mission experts are rather comfortable with, because Christians have got hundreds of years of thinking about how you enter a new world, right? It's the mission field. You go into the mission field and you send your missionaries and you build your churches and you bring light into the darkness and so on. And if you've got some post-colonial theology, as I know you do on this course, then hopefully you're thinking, oh, that sounds a bit unfortunate. But that's the kind of language that was used quite extensively by Christians thinking about cyberspace. They're bringing light into the darkness. And if you think about the digital not as just a tool for communicating with people, but as a world to enter, then kind of theologically, I think the logical thing to do is to start planting churches. And this is, I think, the motivation behind a lot of the creation of online churches, at least before the pandemic hit. So Douglas Estes in 2009 writes a book called Sim Church. That's the front cover you can see on the left. Sim Church is about virtual worlds like what was called Second Life. And you can see there on the right an image of a church that was built in Second Life, which was a virtual world where you could build anything you wanted. And Estes is really sold on this idea of the digital as a mission field. And he argues if a synthetic world, by which he means a virtual world, cannot contain a real church, that world is unreachable. The cause of Christ is lost in that world. And he goes to lots of work to show how many people are out there playing video games and in virtual worlds and how few churches there are out there. And he's really imagining this like a whole continent that has been discovered. And it's the job of Christians to put churches in that continent to reach as many people as possible. So we'll think a little bit about the history of this, because it's the idea of doing church online has become rather relevant to a lot of people over the last year. This is not a new thought. This, as far as I can see, is the first example of an online Christian worship event, all the way back in 1986. There's a very early computer network called PresbyNet, and it organized a memorial prayer service after the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. And a theologian, David Lockhead, who did some pioneering work on digital theology, wrote in his reflection on this that the event demonstrated the power of the computer medium to unite a community in time of crisis beyond the limits of geography or denomination. And one thing that's really interesting about this event to me is that it's an example of a theme that runs through a lot of writing about online churches, and actually a lot of writing about online community more generally, which is the importance of trauma and tragedy and death in proving that a community is real. I don't know if this also shows up in mission writing in other areas, but I wouldn't be surprised. If there are people out there saying, how did I know that my fresh expression of church was real? Well, somebody died and it really affected us. But you certainly see this a lot in writing about the digital. How do we know that online relationships are real? Let me tell you the story of my cancer diagnosis, or let me tell you the story of what happened after one of the members of our group died. And in this vision, online community and online church is it's a profound coming together of people to offer support in a time where no one else can do that. So that's one vision of what happens online. Here's another. This was formed around the same time, 1985. I've only ever found one reference to it, and it's in this really disastrous, a report which is quite interesting but has a very unfortunate title, produced by the Church of England, called Cybernauts Awake. The word cybernaut did not take off. But if you're thinking about this idea of the digital as a world that you go into, cybernaut it's like astronauts, right? They're imagining users of the internet being like astronauts going into this whole new universe. So it was the Church of England's big report on what to do with the internet from the end of the 1990s. And there's an anecdote in there about a new church formed in 1985, which claimed that for the first time, people could worship in spirit and in truth and not be distracted by others who might be fat, short, beautiful, or ugly. People are pared down to pure spirit. And that little bit at the end is said to be a quote from the creators of the church. But again, this is the only place I've seen this referenced. I have no idea who it was who launched this other than this little bit. So there's a very different vision of online church here, which I find very interesting. And the imagination here is more like the internet as an escape. It's a way of escaping from the flesh. All of the things that slow people down and distract them and are not beautiful. Online, we can transcend to a higher plane of spiritual existence. And those two visions of the online church have been fighting with each other through particularly Christian commentary ever since. Is online church a celebration of human connectedness and our ability to offer each other support in times of crisis? Or is it the ultimate climax of our cruel, self-centered, consumerist isolation? And if you go and read supporters of online church, they'll say it's definitely the former. And if you read critics of online church, they'll tend to say it's definitely the latter. And hopefully those two case studies have shown you there's actually maybe a bit of truth in both. But here is another example of an early kind of online church. This is one that I did my research on long ago. It's called Church of Fools, and it was a product of the Methodist Church, or funded by the Methodist Church, I should say, in the UK. There was a brief moment in 2004 when the British Christian church was leading the world in digital innovation. And I'm not sure it's really happened before or since, but there's this brief moment in 2004 when the Church of England produces a church and the Methodists produce an online church, and there's another group that produces an online church, and it's all happening in the UK. This, as you can see, is it's a little online space. It's got two rooms. There's the one you can see here, and there's a little crypt downstairs. You can only fit about 30 or 40 bodies in this room at a time. But the demands to get into this, lots and lots of journalists wanted to write about it. And the demand to get in was so high that you'd have hundreds of people watching the 30 or 40 lucky souls who were the first ones to log in. You'd have lots of people who were kind of invisible, walking around the room as ghosts. This actually only ran for a few months. It was an experiment to see what could be done. And it was launched with the kind of mission field language that I'm talking about here with. We've got to reach the people who are using the internet and they need churches. And one of the most striking things that came out of this was the formation of a community of people who worked together under very difficult circumstances and ended up becoming friends and remaining a worshiping community all the way up to the present day. They're now connected on Facebook and had their last service not too long ago. These are other examples of online churches launched a few years later in the virtual world of Second Life. This is the Anglican Cathedral of Second Life, and here things start to get a little bit trickier, maybe theologically. The Church of Fools was funded by the Methodists, and they had a rule that nobody was allowed to use a title. No one was allowed to identify themselves as a minister or a priest or anything else. That rule doesn't apply in Second Life. So this, you can see here, is the Anglican Cathedral of Second Life. It was formed by an Anglican living in New Zealand who actually didn't have authorization from anybody. He had no right to call this Anglican or to call it a cathedral or to put the Anglican flag on it. He just felt like it and thought it would be good publicity. And elsewhere in the virtual world, there were people more seriously, I think, running Catholic churches, calling themselves Father so-and-so of the Catholic Church and taking confession, who had no sacramental authority to do that from anywhere. This virtual world became a space where actually quite a lot of people got to try out what it might be like to be a missionary. It was a world full of artists and people creating things, and Christians could go in there and build a space that looked like a church and just preach for a while and see if anyone wanted to come along and listen. we come into another point about digital theology here, which I'll mention before I move on, which goes back to that question we asked at the very beginning about does the church need a digital theology? Is there a distinctive theology of digital culture? Now, Life Church, that big Oklahoma megachurch I mentioned, ran a campus in Second Life. And it was designed to be a perfect replica of one of their buildings in the real world, which in the kind of megachurch way have no distinctive architecture anyway. They're designed to look like a shopping mall or a cinema. But there was no in-world activity, really. They built this place. You could go in there, you could watch the sermon on the big screen. But Craig Groeschel, the pastor of Life Church, was not wasting his time thinking about virtual theology in this or producing any materials specific to the virtual world. It was just kind of a broadcast opportunity. The Anglican Cathedral of Second Life was a bit different because they actually emerged as a group of people who were very interested in playing in this world and building. And they started facing theological questions that the traditional theologians struggled with. For example, you can do whatever you want in this virtual world. A lot of people set up families. So you'd build a little house, and you'd meet someone else in the virtual world, and you'd say, let's live as a family, and we'll say this is our house. And maybe we'll have a virtual wedding, kind of as a role play thing. If you know anybody who plays The Sims, you can do the same kind of thing in The Sims. You make little families and play around with them. And this could be emotionally very significant for people involved in playing the game. So right at the beginning, some of the participants in the Anglican Cathedral of Second Life said, should we have weddings here? And would it really be sinful if somebody in Second Life was having sex with somebody else in Second Life with their virtual avatars? Because it's not real bodies, so is it real sin? And this caused a real kind of chaotic argument in the community at the time. There were some people who thought actually it was reasonable to explore digital theology in a new kind of way in a new environment, and there were other people who said absolutely not and shut it down very quickly. But what they did find is that having a space in a virtual world where some people were involved in creative artistic things and others were involved in something that seemed a lot more like sexual sin was a very powerful mission opportunity, because there was always somebody sitting at the church, the Anglican Cathedral of Second Life. Everybody knew where it was. And so actually fairly regularly, somebody would come by and say, I'm not a Christian, I'm not planning on joining a church, but I really want to talk to somebody about this awful situation I'm in, or I need someone to talk me through this decision I've got to make. And so they found hanging out in this space was quite effective as a kind of missionary opportunity. Certainly not on the level of 100,000 salvations as they're claiming over at the Life Church megachurch, but they had some important conversations with people just by kind of being present in a space and being open to thinking about the culture that was emerging in that space. Yes, I don't want to get too distracted here. There's a long, complicated, odd, kind of symbiotic relationship between particularly evangelical Christianity and the pornography industry and technology. We can talk about that later on in the questions if you want to, but I'm going to get distracted by it now, so we shall move on. So those are some ways of doing church. Here is Life Church again, imagining a really different way of doing church. And this is much closer, I think, to what's going on in the last year or so. Life Church was not particularly interested in entering cyberspace as a new world with its own distinctive new culture. They want to be part of your everyday life. And so they're using mobile apps and social media and so on to kind of carry on sending you church updates. I really like the tagline here, experience Life Church anytime, anywhere. That reminds us something very important about any kind of online church, which is that actually that vision of cyberspace as a world to enter is very incomplete. The internet has never really been a separate world from everyday life. What people do online is often they talk about their everyday lives. The way you engage online is influenced by what you've got going on around you in your daily life. When I was doing research on this, I interviewed people who were, they would go to a really exciting charismatic church online and they'd dance around while they were listening to the music, but they'd have to do it really quietly because they were in Wales and it was 2 o'clock in the morning and they were watching a service in America and their parents were asleep next door. And a story like that really shows you how entangled the online and the everyday are, I think. So here we've got a story from the Church of Scotland, from a group called Sanctuary First, which launched a few years ago, with an anecdote about a retired man in his 80s in Bournemouth looking for an online church to listen to. He didn't want the American style, he wanted a British style of church, and ended up finding St Andrew's Bowness as a church that was live streaming at the time. One comment before we move on. Sanctuary First launched in about 2016 with a big media splash claiming it was the first ever online church, which I found really interesting because, as I've hopefully shown you, there was 30 years of online churches before this came along. But it's a theme of online church activity that all the way up to the present moment, it seems like every group that launches an online church claims to be the first ever to do it. Even during the pandemic, it seemed like a lot of churches were starting from scratch and we're going to do something online. This is really radical and new. And my interpretation of that is that it comes out of the language of mission field. Kind of inherent to the concept of a mission field is that no one else got to the mission field before you. You're bringing light into the darkness. There's no point bringing light into a room that's had lights on for 30 years. So this kind of fits in with the history of missions as well, the way that missionaries entered a culture and then stamped out or ignored or swept aside all of the Christian activity that had often been going on for centuries in that place already, in order to pretend that this was it was a barren field and they were planting the gospel in it, and doing a bit of ploughing. Anyway, so maybe that's one reason why people doing online church activity have often been so keen, I think, to pretend that it's newer than it really is. So what happened to all of this? And I'm doing my best to keep an eye on the time. Again, from the 90s and the early 2000s, there's huge excitement about the Christian world being transformed by digital mission led by digital churches. It's the future of evangelism. And this is motivated partly by enthusiasm, but mostly by fear, I think. You think back to that example I showed you earlier on of online church as the escape from the body. There's lots of really worried theology being written at this time from Christian leaders who are saying, online church is going to be the end of everything. It's a disaster. It's Christians being lazy and superficial and too scared to get into a proper community. But kind of on both sides, people agreed this was going to be big. So you have George Barna, for example, the polling expert, writing in the late 1990s that by 2010, we will have 10 to 20% of the US population relying primarily or exclusively upon the internet for its religious input. And of course, that didn't happen. So this is my kind of embarrassing confession bit. I wrote my book about online churches in 2017, that was published. And the final section of that is called something like, what happened to the church of the future? Because at that point, it was pretty clear that all of these promises had not come true. There was an expectation that online church would enormously explode in popularity. And actually, it was trickling along, but it seemed to be in decline at that point. It seemed fairly clear that the big denominations like the Methodists and the Church of England had moved on. Online church, and one reason for them moving on, I think, is that the way we think about the internet had changed. No one was talking about cyberspace anymore. We were not worried anymore about the internet being a world to enter or in field. It was now just everyday life. And so the metaphor had changed. And the response had changed. If the internet's part of everyday life, you don't need to put churches in it. You just need to get the church down the street to go online. But also, I think, online church had not fulfilled its promise in a way, and that's more tricky to get our heads around. There was an expectation that the internet was a mission field, and if you built churches in it, people would convert, congregations would grow, there would be growth in some way. And you see the same thing around a lot of attempts to update Christian mission, like Fresh Expressions, for example. Ways of thinking about new sorts of Christianity are often tied up in a promise of growth. The reason we're doing this is because we will reach new audiences. And that didn't really happen for the online church. It seemed, up until 2020, it seemed pretty clear that online churches mostly appealed to people who were actually already going to church somewhere else. It was an opportunity to deepen and strengthen your involvement in church community. You'd go to church on Sunday, but you'd also join an online community and you'd talk to them all the way through the week. Maybe you'd go to church on Sunday, but you'd also watch Life Church midweek to get a different kind of sermon input. What changed? Well, of course, COVID. So my book became, well, that little bit of my book became very suddenly out of date. And we've seen, in some ways, we've seen just turning the whole clock back to the 1990s and the way Christians think about digital media. There's an explosion in churches trying to get online. Mission is once again being done in a digital space. And as part of that, people are starting to make claims about evangelism again. The sort of claims that we hadn't seen for a few years before that. And you've probably heard this as well, particularly early on in the pandemic. There were lots of news stories attracting lots of attention, claiming that the nation was going to turn back to prayer in this time of crisis. Going online had opened the church, had made it accessible to people. Everyone was in a crisis, and we were all going to come together around online church settings. Now, I don't know what you think about that, but that's another thing that would be interesting to talk about later on if we have a bit of time for questions. So let's move on. I'm going to force myself to stop wittering on about my favorite research topic. So we've talked about digital media as a tool for evangelism, and we've talked about digital media as a world or a mission field for evangelism. And now we're going to talk about two other possibilities: digital media as a culture and as an empire. Now, digital culture is the topic of the chapter I asked you to read by Catherine Schmidt in a pretty good book, I think, about digital mission. So if you're interested in this topic, I can recommend the rest of that book. You've got all sorts of theologians and practitioners thinking about what it means to do mission or to do evangelism in digital contexts. And Catherine Schmidt's chapter, right at the beginning of the book, is about enculturation, basically. She's going to Catholic theology of mission to ask for techniques and approaches that could be used in a digital context. And she doesn't really talk about the kind of the world and mission field ideas, but she does talk about the language of the tool, and argues the more Christians use the language of instrument or tool with regard to digital technology, the more they will struggle to imagine effectively the relationship between the gospel and the modern world. The internet is more than just a tool, which is a theme I've hopefully emphasized through this lecture. Digital media, she says, should be understood not as tools for our use, but as a culture. And that opens up a whole bunch of mission thinking, because of course, as I've mentioned before, Christians have a long history of thinking about how to do mission across cultures. So she mentions 3 different Catholic responses from different popes, with a model of enculturation from John Paul II, replaced with an idea of a new evangelization under Benedict, and then a cultural encounter from Pope Francis. And she ends up quoting a recent encyclical of Pope Francis, in which he suggests that the church is constantly reshaping her identity through listening and, hang on, let me move the pictures of you, which are covering up the quote, through listening and dialogue with the people, the realities, and the history of the lands in which she finds herself. So this is quite interesting, quite useful approach for thinking about digital missions. It's not as restricted as the idea of a world or a mission field used to be. It's open to the understanding that digital is part of everyday life. But it's also suggesting that there's going to be an encounter with a distinctive culture that has emerged in online settings, distinctive expectations of how relationships will work, how conversations will work, how confessions and disclosures will work. And Schmidt's argument in this chapter is that the church needs to understand how conversations work in digital culture before it can try to share the gospel there effectively. So Schmidt has 3 suggestions. The first is that everybody needs to know about digital literacy. In other words, people need to be trained in digital culture and what it actually is. The second is to engage in active listening. Seeking spaces in which to listen to the concerns and values within social networks online. So if you're talking to a culture, there's a much greater understanding, I think, that the culture might have some things to say back to you. It's not just a matter of entering a world and planting a church, but encountering people who maybe have different understandings of themselves and each other and might have some things to teach you, or at least some things to talk about. So Schmidt argues, approach with openness and charity the culture in which the church seeks to embed itself. And finally, and this I think is a point we could disagree with, she argues that we should focus all evangelism on relationality. So the question is not how do you get the gospel across using a new tool, but who can we accompany, who can we encounter, and how can we be authentically ourselves in digital contexts? So what does this look like in practice? I had a look around on the internet for Christians trying to give advice about how to use digital media. And this kind of cultural approach is quite common. So here's a blog post, for example, for a teen website called The Greatest Story Ever Told, Evangelizing on Instagram. And it's actually all about understanding the culture of Instagram. The author has a variety of key points, but one of them is beauty. And his argument here essentially is that Christians who want to do evangelism on Instagram should be sharing very beautiful images. There is a Christian theology of beauty and aesthetics. The Lord is the King of beauty. But also Instagram is all about beautiful images. If you're not sharing beautiful images, you're not understanding the culture of Instagram, and you're just not doing mission or evangelism properly. So as he comments here, after all, the Lord is the King of beauty. If you're sharing a picture of yourself at church, don't be afraid to splash a filter on it to make it pop, which I think is quite a nice jump from very transcendent theology to extremely practical details of how to make this work. But this is all very well, and I think there are some limits to Schmidt's argument that we should be aware of, because this is a bit of a problem that has bedeviled digital theology for a very long time. Why is it that Schmidt thinks that digital culture is all about relationality? My guess is that it's because Schmidt is coming to this with a theology of relationality, because digital culture is not all about relationality. It's not all about conversations. It's about a lot of other things as well. So what is so captivating about the digital world or digital culture is not that you can have deep one-to-one conversations with people. It's that you've got the freedom to explore new ideas, new experiences, new identities, perhaps in a distanced and anonymous way. So I am on Instagram. I follow hundreds, quite possibly thousands of people on Instagram. I do not have relationships with all of them or conversations with all of them. Most of the time, I would be incredibly unsettled if those people sent me a message and said, let's talk about your soul. That's not what I'm there for. The point of digital culture is that you can experience lots and lots of things in a way that is actually at a little bit of a distance. Yeah, you're in charge of what you're looking for. And actually, that's another kind of advantage and challenge for evangelism and mission. that's an opportunity. As you may know, there are really two kinds of church that have grown over the last few years, statistically. It's churches that offer a big dramatic experience, like a kind of megachurch style of performance, or cathedrals. And the success of cathedrals has been kind of a puzzle for religion watchers in the UK. That's not modern at all. What's going on? But one of the things that cathedral offers is a distanced, anonymous experience of religion. It's incredibly beautiful. The music will be wonderful, and nobody will talk to you. And that actually is quite appealing to a lot of people in contemporary culture. The last thing you want, as somebody who is maybe perhaps interested in spirituality but not quite sure, is a church where you'll be buttonholed at the door by 3 people who want to take you for lunch. Well, some people want that, but actually maybe overemphasizing relationality would be a mistake. So this takes us all the way back to the beginning with that website, peacewithgod.net, which I was quite rude about to start with, because it's just a couple of videos and some chat opportunities. How could that possibly be successful? But actually, in a way, that is listening to digital culture. It's providing people with a resource where they can find out information at their own speed, at their own time, with an opportunity for a further chat if wanted. So that's my hesitation about Schmidt's approach to digital culture. Maybe digital culture is a bit more complicated than she thinks it is. This is also a challenge, though, for mission or evangelism. This is an interview I did with somebody who was trying to run a church in Second Life, that virtual world, quite a long time ago. And it's stuck with me because he was so sad about his church, I think. He was doing his very best to run an online church where he would evangelize as he understood it. And that included talking to people about sin and challenging them to improve their lives. And what he found is that's not digital culture. Digital culture is it's distanced, it's anonymous, it's self-directed, and if a conversation gets weird, you leave. So, as he says in this interview, I let people know they need to grow. A lot of times they say that they don't want to hear me. I get some that come a time or two. They tell me they really like the message and then they never come back. I tell them they need a closer relationship with God, but they feel better and then they jump right back into sin. It hurts a lot and I know I feel God's pain, which was a bit sinister. So this is an issue. How do you do, and this is something we talked about a lot in the initiation class a couple of weeks ago. How do you think about initiation or discipleship in a context where people can shut you down, block you, move off to another website the moment it stops being fun for them? Obviously, that's a bit of a broader conversation about contemporary culture, in which people generally are expecting their spiritual experiences to be fulfilling and exciting and transformative and fun and not hard work all of the time. So that's taken us through the main 3 ideas I wanted to think about. Briefly, keep an eye on the time, I want to talk about a 4th option here, which is digital media as an empire. And this I think is not something that gets discussed very much, certainly not in that book that I recommended that you read, but it's worth Christians reflecting on. Digital media aren't just cultures. They're not just groups of people who've come together to have a lovely conversation on social media. They're also creations. Somebody built Twitter, somebody built Facebook. They made it be the way it is. The algorithms that run those social media sites choose what you get to see. They choose which friends you get to hear from. They decide who's, if you are a Christian trying to share messages, the system is set up to work out who will see those messages. And we've become very aware over the last 4 years or so, certainly since 2016, of the ways in which digital and social media systems can actually be set up in ways that guide us to think in quite radical, extreme, maybe conspiratorial and dangerous ways. The spreading of fake news is one example that got loads and loads and loads of attention after 2016. And of course, at the heart of these systems, there are a very small number of people with huge amounts of power and vast amounts of wealth, who are not really beholden to any states, national borders at all. And that isn't that part of the Christian digital mission, to speak truth to power, to perhaps, or to look at what power is doing to the way we communicate. And actually, I think the main Christian answer to that has been, oh no, we don't want to talk about that, which is quite interesting. So here's the Church of England Digital Charter. I don't have a list of the participants in this session. Justin, if you're here, we can talk about this later, but I'm guessing probably the Archbishop is not here today. So a couple of years ago, the Church of England launched a digital charter of good behaviour on the internet. And they want everyone to sign up to this. And they launched it with great fanfare in partnership with Facebook, which I thought was fascinating. And here is a picture of the wonderfully cozy conversation that Nicola Mendelsohn, who was running Europe for Facebook, had a very important job at the time, with the Archbishop of Canterbury, sitting very close together, having a lovely time. At no point in this conversation did either of them ask an awkward question. Throughout the whole conversation, which you can watch on Facebook if you want to, Justin Welby suggests that really, we all know that social media can be very mean, but if only we were kind, that would make it all better. And Nicola Mendelsohn is obviously very excited to talk to Justin Welby and talks about what a great job the Archbishop of Canterbury is doing. She does not ask him any awkward questions about the track record of the Church of England. He does not ask her one question about Facebook perhaps not being a lovely place for people to hang out. Is that digital mission? Well, here's the charter. It imagines actually something that I think is quite consistent with the Catherine Schmidt model of listening to culture. Social media is a public way of enabling us to live out our calling to share the good news of Jesus. It is immediate, interactive, conversational, open-ended. That's that kind of relational theme we were talking about. But this comes with downsides if users do not apply the same common sense, kindness, and sound judgment we would use in a face-to-face encounter. And here are the rules of the charter. It's about be safe, be respectful, be kind, be a good ambassador. I think really that was pretty key for why the church wanted to do this. They were fed up with vicars complaining about the Church of England on Twitter. Disagree well, follow the rules. Is that digital mission? Is it digital mission to follow the rules? So there's nothing in there about protesting or campaigning or trying to make the world a better place, which I think is interesting. And this is not just practical. Do you remember the case of Gerald Robinson Brown from earlier this year? Gerald Robinson Brown is one of the relatively few Black clergymen in the Church of England, and he published a tweet at the death of Captain Tom Moore, saying that he would not be joining the national clap because it was emblematic of a cult of white British nationalism. And people went absolutely bananas about this. They were very, 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 very angry. He received a huge amount of abuse online. And even though, as you can see in the tweet, he describes Captain Tom Moore as a kind and generous soul, he's talking about the government's response, really, to the death of Captain Tom Moore and how this individual was turned into a symbol for national unity. The Diocese of London responded to that by punishing Gerald Robinson Brown, apologising for him and announcing that he would sign the church's digital charter. And very quickly after this, I think they realised they made a mistake and produced some new statements saying that actually maybe racism was bad, and they thought that abusing their own vicar on Twitter was also bad. But I think it's really interesting that their first response was to say he broke the digital charter. And that vision of digital mission, as I see it, is about following the rules, not rocking the boat, being safe and kind, but not challenging or causing upset in a way that I think theologically we could have some things to say about. Okay, So we're coming to the end, I promise, leaving a bit of time for questions. Does the mission of the church have anything to say about this kind of thing? Safiya Noble has written a very famous book quite recently called Algorithms of Oppression, which talks about how search engines reinforce racism, demonstrates and argues that racism and sexism are part of the architecture and language of technology. Her argument, which is fairly obvious, I guess, is that the technologies that we use were made by people. Often there were only white people in the room, often they were all men, and their prejudices are built into the systems that the rest of us are using all the time. And it begins with an anecdote from a few years ago when Professor Noble herself was trying to find resources on Google to help her Black children. So she typed Black girls into Google, and the first page of results were all pornography. Google was set up in a way that assumed that anyone asking about Black girls would be looking for pornography, not resources to help teach their children. And after complaints about this, that was changed. But that's kind of the insight that starts off this quest in this book, to look at the ways in which the technology we're using is actually set up in with some pretty terrible assumptions built into it. Is that part of the digital mission of the church? And if so, who's doing it, I guess? So there we go. Final reminder of our 3 basic principles for a theology of technology. Technology is never neutral. Technology is invisible, but we're not helpless. We have an opportunity to reflect on the technologies we use, to decide what to do with them, and to shape how we think about them. And there I'll stop. Thank you for listening. I hope you've got some questions or complaints or things you want to talk about.
Well, thank you, Tim, so much. I mean, you've packed so much into this presentation. So I wonder if you, if you can stop sharing your screen, and we'll be able to see everyone, and open the floor. Paul, go ahead.
Just a reflection and a question. I mean, I think you're absolutely right about, the whole thing being about safety and about distance and being in control. And I think 2 things I wanted to say. One was that on the positive side, in terms of evangelism mission, my experience talking to other people has been, people have been engaging with church life because they can actually look at it from a distance. It's safe. They can close it down or whatever. And that creates a space for which they can then, if they want to, negotiate further down. But from a theological point of view, this whole thing about distance, I think that cuts across something very fundamental about Christianity, which is something to do with intimacy with God, intimacy with each other, which crosses over with things like social responsibility and accountability. And I think so. I'm not sure whether the digital thing really works because of that. I don't see how they can be mutually together. I'm not suggesting you are, but that idea of intimacy and distance don't go together, I don't think.
Thank you. So that's an interesting thought, and I don't know if any of the rest of you have experience of being part of a digital community or a digital friendship. You certainly can find intimacy online, and a lot of people find that actually their main support network might be online nowadays. It's much easier to find a group of people who maybe share the same experience you've been through, who've got the same interests, who are willing to talk to you all day, every day, about whatever you're particularly interested about. But there are some differences in the way intimacy works online. One is that it tends to be more short-lived, I think, but quite very fast, but very short-lived. When I was doing research in online churches, I found they're often quite small communities, and people would come in, they would become like the heart and soul of the community, and after a year or so they would leave, or less than that perhaps. Or the whole community would have a schism or an explosion, or it would shut down, or the one person who knew how the website worked would leave, or something like this. So there's much less of a sense that you're going to have multiple generations of people living in the same community together for a long period of time. You also find that often online groups that have that kind of closeness are also quite homogenous in one way or another. They tend to be based of people who have quite a lot in common, and people who get along together. It is more difficult, in my experience, to cope in an online community with somebody who you just cannot stand, because it's much harder to avoid them. So that means they tend to be much less diverse. And you don't have, so for example, in a local church community, you might have a lot of people who actually don't have anything in common, except that they live in the same neighborhood. And because of that, you've got people across different generations, people with different educational backgrounds, people with different interests. I think you are less likely to find that in an online space. You're probably going to have a lot of people who've got pretty much exactly the same life position, the same politics, perhaps. Sometimes that can be really powerful. You can get a group of progressive Christians together who are all equally excited about reading the same book and changing the world in the same way, and that can be a very powerful learning experience. On the other hand, I was recently reading an article about eating disorder online groups, which is just one of many, many kinds of groups that have emerged online that actually can be extremely dangerous, because they're able to exist without any supervision from people who disagree with a particular view of the world and encourage one another into more and more extreme behavior. So yes, some intimacy online is certainly possible, and it's something that a lot of people have found, but it's different in quite important ways from what you might expect in a local congregation. Anyway.
Oh, Jeff, then Mary, then Pete.
An observation that applies not just to the life of the church online, but people's lives in a much wider sense, is that it's completely challenging and changing the idea of local geography. You can affiliate with people who, I mean, you described somebody in Wales who's worshipping with a Pentecostal church in America. And certainly for the Anglican Church, where geography has been a sort of staple given, that's a very radical change. But as a church, we too have the capacity to have a reach way beyond our local geographical area. And certainly many churches during lockdown have discovered that. I've collected a few congregation members several hundred miles away, and I think that's been a very wide and common experience. But the longer term implications of that, the idea that your church experience becomes what happens on screen primarily in a service, rather than the interaction of people of different age groups and demographics in the local community, I think is one of the biggest, most profound changes, and one that worries me, if I'm frank about it, because I think the depth of engagement is much shallower.
Yeah, so one response to that would be to say that this is not the first time that's happened, and even the motor car, for example, changed the way people engage with their local environment, and it allowed people to travel long distances to choose the church they really wanted to go to, and set up suburbs where actually nobody needs to know their neighbor because they're all commuting somewhere else to work, etc. But if you're thinking about mission, then this really is a change. Is a church a group of people who enjoy talking to each other and supporting each other? Or is it a group of people who share a commitment to a neighborhood? And I think the traditional Anglican vision has been more of the latter, and the online vision is much more of the former. Though those people from hundreds of miles away who are joining your church may be making a great contribution, but they're probably not going to join the rota to clean the cemetery anytime soon. And if commitment to place is part of the mission of church, then that becomes more difficult to manage potentially in a digital context.
There's another dimension to that, if I can just come back to you, and that is the danger of homogenization, that you end up with groups of people who reinforce each other's view. Nobody's able to challenge it, and they actually become very unaware of what anybody else thinks outside of the group that they're part of. And that, as you rightly said, happened to some extent when people became a bit more willing to choose the church they wanted to go to. But, you know, internationally, as well as nationally, it sets up a more substantial sort of polarization of people into groups in which they don't even know that other people think differently from them.
Yes, that may be true. It's I know one of the classic principles of the church growth movement, right, is to get people into homogenous cultural blocks where they feel like they're going to church means they hang out with the people they want to be friends with anyway, and they're not, and everybody's just like them. And so you have youth churches and so on. But yes, it's certainly, I think, a very diverse group is more difficult to form online in that kind of way.
I'm aware that time is ticking away, so maybe we could take the next 3 questions together, and you could then respond, if that's okay, Tim, to do it like that. So let's go with Mary, your question or comment, and then Pete, and then Susie.
Mine's really just a comment. An area that I'm not sure where it fits into your analysis is the idea of digital church as a gateway to what we might call real church. The idea that if you've been attending services online, you get to know the faces of the people who lead, and then you're more likely to feel at home when you go into the building sometime.
Okay, thank you.
Mine was just I kept thinking about that film Ready Player One all the way through. You know, how they had this great line at the beginning where they talk about the Oasis as this virtual space, saying like, we go there for what we can do, but we stay there for who we can be, and how they can create the kind of person they want to be. And so there's a whole relationship between what is real. And I think sometimes that as Christians, we've not taken this seriously enough, that this is not just something which is a fad. This is people's definition of reality. And doing what we do corporeally and putting it online is not the same as being digitally aware, I don't think. But just music more than anything.
I just wanted to make a comment on the conversation with Jeff. So you said you were talking about commitment to place, but actually what really is missing is commitment to community for people who are joining services online from a great distance, or joining church online from a great distance. They and it goes both ways. They cannot be committed to the community in the way that church members normally are, and equally, how do they get their pastoral support when they need it?
Okay, thank you. So yes, so one response maybe to Susie's comment there is that so at least some of the people who are joining online can't join in locally. So some of the and this is some of the people who were pioneering online church a long time ago were disabled, they were elderly, they were in some cases they were queer Christians in local areas where that wasn't going to be acceptable to do that visibly. So this has often been the case with kind of technological shifts, but the people right at the forefront were often people who were left out by the church as it currently existed. My perception is that with the great rush to get everybody online in the pandemic, the role of those people as a fantastic resource of knowledge and expertise has not really been acknowledged at all, and they've been replaced by shiny new people commissioned by the mainstream authorities. But I think Ellie's doing a session on disability, so I will leave that for discussion elsewhere. Support online certainly happens. If you find talking supportive, which a lot of people do, you can talk through your problems in enormous detail online in a way that's actually very difficult to do face to face. One hesitation about that, speaking as someone who's been in a lot of online communities, is that often talking through your problems is not necessarily the best way to escape from them. It can be a kind of repetitive cycle of every day talking through your problems and receiving support to tell you that everything is fine, and then the next day you need to talk through your problems again. You don't have the kind of range of possibilities that you've got in a face-to-face community to actually help somebody. So do more than just constantly tell them that they're okay. Thinking of Mary's comment about the bridge, this is discussed in the Missio Dei book that I suggested as you're reading for this, not in the particular chapter, but elsewhere. There is certainly a hope that online and digital mission can bridge people into face-to-face community. And that, on the one hand, I think almost anybody who comes to Christianity now is going to find part of their journey online. I will be really amazed if somebody came to Christianity in this day and age without at least looking up information online, watching some videos, having some conversations. It's part of how we find out information about everything. So of course it's part of how people find out information about faith journeys. On the other hand, I think listening to digital culture as a culture also means respecting that culture in its own right. The reason why people spend so much time online is because they find value in that online activity, not in going online for a couple of minutes and then going offline to do what they really want to do somewhere else. So I found, looking at online churches, that a lot of them tried to function as a bridge, and they tried to really push people to get into small, intimate communities to meet up face to face. And this often wasn't actually very successful. Because people who were involved in digital expressions of Christianity wanted it to stay digital. They actually enjoyed the distance and the freedom and the anonymity, and they didn't particularly want to give that up and get into some kind of close, intimate relational group. But certainly there are stories of faith moving between online and offline worlds, and I think that kind of bridge approach is going to be part of any successful online evangelism, but not the full story. I would see the bridge working from maybe an online beginning to combining online and offline, to a world in which your faith actually finds expression offline as well as online, but not a sort of simplistic from website to church. I think those were our 3 questions. Do we have any final comments or well?
I'm conscious that that time is running out on us. Michelle, is it a quick comment?
Maybe. It was just, I wanted to say, do you think it's okay? Because I am utterly petrified by anything digital. I hate the fact that all our services are online. All my sermons are recorded. People can look them up. I'm not a social media sort of person. And it does, that whole world utterly petrifies me. And do you think that it's okay and valid to not be part of it as a Christian? In terms of mission, I mean, is it still valid to say my mission is going to be face to face with people, not with the digital world?
Well, so as a first thought, we're all online now, and you've made it. So congratulations, you're digital people. We're not necessarily talking about everybody individually going out there and building the next Google with their bare hands. I would say if you take Catherine Schmidt's chapter, if you want to read that, her argument is that you have to start with listening, which is just about spending time online, finding people you're interested in listening to, finding websites you enjoy reading. I'm fairly sure that there was something out there for everybody. So again, if you are nervous about the digital world, then just hanging about and listening and finding people you're interested in talking to is a very valid start. But also part of that, Schmidt's argument, is that you listen to the culture in which you're doing mission. You don't start off by saying the digital is our culture. You say, look, so I'm doing mission to young people in the town I live in, or I'm doing mission to elderly people in, you know, a particular congregation, whatever it is that you've thought of as a kind of location where you're doing mission. And then you talk to those people and you listen to those people and you find out what they're actually doing with their lives. And if you find out that actually the community you're interested in, or the culture you're interested in doing mission with, is spending a lot of its time online, then I might suggest that actually finding a way to participate in that would be part of your mission. If you find you're talking to a lot of other people who also say they're very nervous about social media and they don't really enjoy anything digital, maybe it isn't. Or maybe part of your mission is helping them to see how they can use Skype to talk to their families more often. But I'd start with the point of listening, like listen to the culture in which you're doing mission, find out what it means to be part of that culture, and then make the digital decision accordingly. I don't think it's as simple as saying everybody needs to go on Twitter and start tweeting their sermons every week. That'd be very boring. Okay.
Well, on that heartening note, don't worry if you haven't tweeted your sermon yet. We really need to thank Tim for this amazing contribution to our week's reflection. I'm clapping quietly so I don't deafen people.
Well, thank you very much for listening, everybody.
Yeah, so thank you for that enriching presentation, the beginnings of that conversation. I feel as though there's quite a lot more that people are going to be thinking through and wanting to thresh out. So thankfully we have a couple of sessions towards the end of the week in which we can do that. I'm going to close this session now, and we will reconvene tomorrow at 9:15, everyone, to hear Dr. Katie Cross come and talk to us about the Sunday Assembly. So if you have any questions already for her, do remember to bring those with you for the discussion. All right, have a good evening, and we'll see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow, everybody.
Thanks for listening, everyone.